The desert wind carried the sound of battle, spears clashing, hooves thundering, and the cries of men. Yet what froze the Egyptian soldiers that day wasn't the might of their enemies' blades, but the sight of cats. Thousands of them, painted on shields, running across the sand, caught between armies and gods. On that day, faith met fear, and faith lost. This is the story of the Battle of Pelusium, where Egypt fell not by sword, but by superstition. If you love stories where history feels stranger than myth, like, subscribe, and stay till the end. The year was 525 BC. The sun hung like a burning coin above the Nile Delta, where the Egyptian fortress city of Pelusium guarded the gate to Africa. Beyond its sandstone walls, the Persian army gathered, an ocean of iron, banners snapping in the dry wind. At their head stood Cambyses II, son of Cyrus the Great, a man determined to complete his father's empire. Inside the city, Pharaoh Psamtik III watched anxiously. Egypt had faced invaders before, Nubians, Assyrians, Libyans, but never an army like this. For the Egyptians, Pelusium was sacred ground. Cats roamed its temples, living symbols of Batet, the goddess of home, fertility, and divine protection. To harm a cat was to invite eternal punishment. Even pharaohs feared it. The people whispered tales of men executed for killing one by accident, of riots sparked by feline deaths. Cats were not pets, they were pieces of the divine. So when Cambyses began his march toward Pelusium, he wasn't merely fighting soldiers. He was fighting a civilization built upon reverence and fear of its gods. Cambyses understood this. He had learned from Persian priests and Greek spies that Egypt's greatest strength, its religion, could also be its downfall. While his generals debated siege towers and battering rams, Cambyses studied Egypt's faith like a weapon. And then, in a stroke of psychological genius, he devised one of the strangest tactics ever seen in warfare. His soldiers were ordered to gather animals sacred to Egypt: cats, ibises, dogs, even sacred bulls. Some were painted on shields. Others were driven before the army as living shields. Imagine it, a horizon of soldiers advancing under banners painted with cats, their shields etched with divine figures. Between the armies, a chaos of sacred creatures meowed, bleated, and shrieked in terror. The Egyptians froze. Their gods had come between them and their enemy. The archers, who moments before had their bows drawn, now hesitated. Could they fire into that mass without angering Batet herself? Could they strike their own symbols of holiness? In that single instant of doubt, the tide of empire began to turn. The Persians charged. Arrows sang through the air, followed by the thunder of cavalry. Cambyses rode at the front, his armor glinting in the scorching sun. Dust rose in great clouds as the Persians crashed into the disoriented Egyptians. Pelusium's defenders, unsure whether to fight or pray, faltered. Shields clattered to the sand. Horses reared. The cats, terrified by the noise, darted in every direction, spreading panic among men who had worshipped them for generations. It wasn't just a battle, it was psychological collapse made flesh. The Persians fought with ruthless precision. Their immortals, the elite guard of the empire, moved like a tide of bronze. The Egyptians, though brave, could not regain formation. Their sacred hesitation had already condemned them. Some soldiers broke ranks entirely, throwing down weapons rather than risk killing a cat. Others fled toward the city, pursued by Persians shouting in foreign tongues. The sands of Pelusium, once golden, darkened with blood and dust. Egypt, proud, ancient, and divine, had met a weapon it had never imagined: belief itself. Inside the city, Pharaoh Psamtik watched from the ramparts as his army disintegrated. His generals pleaded for action, to rally the troops, to strike back, but the king knew it was too late. The very faith that bound his people now paralyzed them. His soldiers were not cowards, they were believers, and believers could not strike their gods. The Persians breached the walls by dusk. Pelusium fell in a single day. What had taken centuries to build was undone by symbols and fear. When the Persians entered the city, the streets echoed with silence. The temples were spared, not out of reverence, but strategy. Cambyses knew Egypt must be conquered not only by war, but by perception. He promised protection for the sacred animals, presenting himself as a friend of Batet, not her enemy. To the priests, it seemed divine will had shifted. To the people, it felt like betrayal from the heavens. For the first time in living memory, Egypt knelt. The aftermath was brutal. The Persian soldiers, exhausted and blood-soaked, celebrated among the ruins. The Egyptians who resisted were executed. Others bowed, their faith fractured. Cambyses, victorious, marched toward Memphis, the heart of Egypt, claiming himself pharaoh. Yet behind his triumph lingered unease. His victory had been won not through valor, but through manipulation of faith. Even his own men whispered about the blasphemy of using sacred beasts as shields. History would remember Cambyses not as a conqueror alone, but as a man who weaponized gods. What makes the story of Pelusium haunting isn't just its cruelty, it's its irony. A civilization built upon divine protection was undone by that very belief. The Egyptians had always trusted their gods to guide and defend them. But faith, when manipulated, can become a prison. Cambyses turned Egypt's devotion into chains that bound its warriors' hands. It was the ultimate psychological ambush, one fought not on the battlefield, but in the soul. Archaeologists and historians still debate the full truth of the cat army. Some say the story was exaggerated by Greek chroniclers like Herodotus, eager to portray Cambyses as both brilliant and mad. Others believe there is evidence in temple inscriptions that suggest the use of sacred imagery in Persian war gear. Whether literal or symbolic, the message remains unchanged. Cambyses understood the mind of Egypt better than its generals did. He didn't just defeat them, he humiliated their gods. The Persians ruled Egypt for nearly 2 centuries after Pelusium, blending their customs with those of the Nile. Temples once devoted solely to Egyptian deities now carried Persian inscriptions. Priests learned to serve new masters. But beneath the surface, resentment simmered. Egyptians whispered prayers to Batet for vengeance, believing that one day their goddess would turn her eyes back toward them. To the faithful, Cambyses' victory had cursed Egypt, not just politically, but spiritually. Cambyses himself would not escape that curse. According to legend, he later desecrated sacred Egyptian tombs and mocked their rituals, only to die mysteriously in the desert, some say by his own hand, others by divine retribution. His empire stretched wide, but peace never followed him. The same gods he had used may have turned against him, proving that even the powerful cannot toy with faith without consequence. The story of Pelusium echoes a timeless truth. Humanity's deepest convictions can be both shield and sword. Belief can inspire civilizations to build pyramids, write scriptures, and face death without fear. But when belief becomes obsession, it blinds. The Egyptians didn't lose because they were weak, they lost because they were devout. Their gods, meant to protect them, became their undoing. Imagine standing on that battlefield at dusk, the air thick with smoke and cries, the sky painted red with dust. Cats weave through the corpses of men who once worshipped them. A Persian standard rises above the walls of Pelusium. The wind carries the smell of incense and blood. Somewhere, a priest falls to his knees, whispering prayers to Batet, unsure if she listens anymore. That silence, that divine absence, was Egypt's real defeat. For Cambyses, the victory was total but hollow. He ruled over a conquered Egypt with suspicion and paranoia, fearing revolt and betrayal. His soldiers, once in awe of his cunning, grew uneasy at his cruelty. Stories spread that the gods of Egypt cursed him, his mind fractured, his empire doomed. Whether true or not, history remembers Cambyses as a conqueror who played with sacred fire. The Battle of Pelusium remains one of history's most haunting lessons, that faith, when weaponized, can destroy even the most enduring civilizations. It reminds us that the human mind, once seized by fear of the divine, can be controlled without chains. Cambyses proved that belief, not blade, could conquer nations. And in doing so, he exposed the fragility that lies beneath all devotion. Centuries later, travelers along the Nile would still speak of Pelusium in hushed tones. They claimed the sands there were haunted, that at night, you could hear cats crying in the wind. Whether it was myth or memory, it served as a warning. Gods, once used as tools of power, never forgive. The ruins of Pelusium still whisper the story of the day men betrayed their own faith for survival. Some historians call Cambyses a genius of psychological warfare, a pioneer who understood that fear of the unseen can paralyze even the strongest armies. Others see him as a monster, a man who desecrated what others held sacred for his own ambition. Perhaps both are true. In the end, history doesn't judge victories by morality, only by memory. And Cambyses' memory is carved in both brilliance and blasphemy. Egypt would rise again, under new dynasties and foreign rulers, but something fundamental had changed. The illusion of divine invincibility had shattered. No longer would gods alone decide the fate of nations, men would. The world was beginning to move from myth to strategy, from miracles to manipulation. Pelusium was a doorway between ages, where religion met reason, and reason won, at a terrible cost. If there's a lesson in Pelusium, it's this: no belief, no empire, no god is immune to exploitation. The human mind, bound by faith, is both a weapon and a weakness. Cambyses may have known this intuitively, or perhaps he simply saw fear and used it. Either way, the result was the same. The Nile ran red, the temples fell silent, and Egypt entered a new era ruled not by pharaohs, but by foreigners. To imagine Pelusium's fall is to imagine the death of certainty. A civilization that thought itself eternal watched its gods mocked by invaders. The banners of Batat fluttered alongside Persian spears. The people who once believed themselves chosen by the divine now bowed to strangers who had turned their gods into tools. Faith didn't vanish that day. It transformed into mourning. Even now, millennia later, the story feels otherworldly. It asks questions that still matter. How far can faith bend before it breaks? When does devotion become blindness? And how do you fight an enemy who knows your soul better than you do? Cambyses' victory wasn't only military, it was philosophical. He won not just Egypt's land, but its mind. The Persians would eventually lose Egypt to Alexander the Great, another man who understood the power of symbols. But even Alexander never forgot Pelusium. When he conquered, he did so by adopting Egypt's gods as his own, not by turning them against their people. Cambyses' tactic was never repeated, perhaps because it couldn't be. Once faith is broken by manipulation, it can never be used the same way again. The Cat Army remains one of history's strangest moments, a collision of war and worship, strategy and sanctity. It shows that the battlefield isn't always made of sand and blood. Sometimes it's the human heart. Cambyses marched through Pelusium with swords and shields, but his true victory came through fear, the fear of sin, of wrath, of divine punishment. That's what toppled Egypt's walls. As night fell over Pelusium, the fires dimmed, and the survivors buried their dead. Cats prowled among the ruins, glowing faintly in torchlight, silent witnesses to humanity's contradictions. Faith had met reality, and reality had won. Somewhere in that darkness, Cambyses stood alone, gazing at the city he had conquered through the minds of men. Victory had never felt so quiet. The sands of Pelusium would bury the bones, the blood, and perhaps the shame. But legends remember what the earth forgets. The tale of the Cat Army lived on in scrolls, temples, and whispers, a warning about how easily gods can become weapons. It is not merely a story of conquest. It's a mirror reflecting the dangers of belief without reason. History often glorifies kings, generals, and empires. Yet the true story of Pelusium belongs to the unseen. The soldiers who trembled, the priests who prayed, the cats that ran between arrows. It is a tragedy told in silence, in the space between courage and conviction. It reminds us that the greatest wars are not fought for land, but for the soul. So when you hear of ancient Egypt's fall, remember this: it wasn't the Persian swords that conquered it. It was the invisible power of faith turned against itself. A weapon sharper than steel, wielded by a man who understood fear. Pelusium's story endures because it forces us to ask, what would we do if our beliefs stood between us and survival? If this story moved you, like, subscribe, and stay with us for more forgotten truths history tried to bury.